You're here for season 7 of the Whole Horse Podcast, now at 110 episodes and counting. I'm your host, Alexa Linton, coming to you from Vancouver Island in Canada. I can't wait to continue to share thought-provoking, edge-pushing, geeky, and often challenging conversations with horse professionals from all areas of our industry who are working to make horses' lives better. This season, you can look forward to more on the specifics of creating enriching, healthy horse spaces, an area I'm particularly passionate about. I'm so excited that you're here listening in, meeting great horsey humans, and hopefully learning a new thing or two about horses and yourself. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Whole Horse Podcast. You are here for our last few episodes of season 7, which has been such a good season, and I've been so grateful to my guests and all of the listeners who have come on for the ride this year. And we're finishing off with some really good ones, and tonight is no exception. I'm here with Dr. Karen Gellman tonight, speaking on the podcast. Welcome, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure. We've been chatting before the podcast, and I was like, I got to start recording because this is so good. And so we're going to get into those questions that we were just chatting about. But I want to start with a beginning here because there will be some listeners that don't know you, don't know your story. And I just want to ask this question about what put you on this path, because you have this passion for posture and postural mechanisms and really supporting horses to live better in gravity. And just, I'm so curious about, what were some of the few driving factors that really sort of set you in motion on this path in your life?
Well, people always say that I have the absolute weirdest life path of anyone they've ever seen. So I'm going to give you the 5-minute version, which is that I studied ancient Greek in college and I was a theater nerd. So I was like going to bring Euripides to the world. And then Reagan happened and you couldn't work in professional theater anymore. So then I became a lingerie designer.
Yes, you did.
I had a lingerie company doing very fancy silk lingerie, and then I took a job with Christian Dior designing for them. And it was really challenging for the first year, and then it was really boring. So I started riding horses again. And I never wanted to do anything else again. I just wanted to spend my life with horses. And at that point, it was too late to be a great rider or a great trainer or anything like that. But I was good at going to school, so I could be a vet. So I went to Cornell vet school, and in order to be accepted at vet school, I had to do all of the science that I very, very carefully avoided when I was an artsy-fartsy. So I had to study biology and chemistry and physics, and I fell in love with physics. So when I started vet school, I was stunned to find out that it's a trade school. You go there and you learn how to look at poop under a microscope and what the vaccine schedules are and, how to draw blood and stuff like that. And it's like, I thought I was going to be a scientist. This is not what I want to be doing. So I had some real soul searching and I ended up deciding to stay on for a PhD. And I studied biomechanics with a brilliant scientist, Dr. John Bertram was my advisor. And he was part of a very famous group. My academic grandfather is, someone very famous at Harvard and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so I wanted to study the horse's back. And I was so dumb. I thought you could do that. I thought oh, I know, I'll figure it out in just 4 years. So, time passed and I ended up doing my dissertation, as it turned out, on the cervical thoracic junction in horses and the role of the nuchal ligament in head movement during gait. So I say now, 20 years later, 25 years later, that I hadn't a clue about ECVM. I never even got that deep. I modeled the movements of the head and neck in the way that is appropriate, but I never even thought about the longus coli or the scalenes or anything like that. I just modeled the nuchal ligament and how much energy was being saved by the nuchal ligament storing strain energy. So, now 25 years later, it's like, oh crap, I missed so much. But that's another story. So, I knew that I didn't want to be a regular vet, but I wanted to practice, and I wanted to practice in, relevant stuff that's interesting to me. And when I was in vet school, I met a guy named Dr. Alan Schoen. So a lot of
Oh, I
people have
know
heard,
him.
you know Alan, okay. So Alan was a Cornell graduate,
Hmm.
and he was invited to give a talk on acupuncture at the
Hmm.
Cornell Vet Conference. And I attended this talk, and it was 3 talks or whatever. And I was like, this is so interesting. And then I went to talk to him after, his thing. I said, like, so, yeah, I mean, this sounds really interesting, but like, in China, someone studying traditional medicine would be studying for 20 years to be a master. How do you expect to like do anything useful taking 5 weekend courses? And he looks at me and he shakes his head and he says, so you think you're going to know something when you get out of vet school?
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, there
Hmm.
you go. You start somewhere.
Mm. Mm.
So I studied acupuncture. I actually made all of Alan's teaching slides for that. And then I also studied chiropractic. And this is while I was in graduate school. And I was convinced that holistic medicine was the way of the future, and that within a very few years, everybody would understand how important this was for equine health. And so I thought that it would be important to get certified. So I got a certification course in acupuncture. And part of the IVA certification is to do an externship. So meanwhile, I was practicing on sport horses in New Jersey, which was like 200 miles from where I lived, but that's where the rich horses lived. And I would go to New Jersey and people said, have you ever heard of Dr. Shoemaker? Oh, she's crazy. And they would tell these stories about how Dr. Shoemaker like put them up against the wall, adjusted their neck, and like they were able to stand up like they couldn't for years. Boundary issues. But Dr. Shoemaker was a genius. And so I decided I was going to do my IVIS internship with Dr. Shoemaker. And at that point, my son was like 9 months old. So I went babysitter in hand down to Judith's farm in Pennsylvania and spent 3 weeks. And it was amazing. And I was watching her work on these horses, and every single horse did the exact same thing with the exact same stimulus and came out the exact same way. And I'm like, what the hell are you doing? And she explained to me that, her clinical model was posture. It's like, posture. Whoever cares about posture? And she explained to me that, well, you've got, the foot balance, and you've got the tooth balance, the dentition, and you've got the pole, which is really important. And if you want the horse to be sound and have top performance and to not keep getting one little lameness after another, you have to make sure that they're all working right. So Judith, oh God, Judith, like 10 years previous to that, she was engaged to Rob Sigafus, who was the farrier at New Bolton. So
Okay.
her practice was like 20 miles from New Bolton, and she was engaged to Rob Sigafus, and she could shoe any horse that came through the door. So she would just like, these horses would come in, she goes, this is all wrong. She'd pull the shoes, she'd trim them, she'd put the shoes back on, just, okay, there you go. That was back 20 years ago. She doesn't do that anymore. But she trained Daisy Bicking. You know Daisy?
I don't actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
should learn. Daisy has this fantastic school, the International School of Integrative Hoof Care.
Ooh.
And Daisy is the podiatry arm of our teaching and research group. And so Judith taught Daisy, and Daisy studied with all these great people. And so, Daisy was there to do the horses, so Judith didn't have to.
Yes.
Anyway, so she had a couple of dentists that she worked with and that she knew could do a really good job. And so what she would do is like, she was everybody's secret weapon. She was licensed in 17 states,
Wow.
everything from Kentucky west, all of the major horse areas. And she was everybody's secret weapon. Any performance horse in any field. We're talking race horses, eventers, dressage people, hunter jumpers, polo, anybody and anything. When they had a problem, she is who they went to, because she was one of the very first people to do acupuncture and chiropractic in horses. And she's so freaking brilliant.
Amazing.
So she's someone who just really intuitively, and she's been a horsewoman her whole life. So she put all those things together. So when Judith starts talking about this posture, I got really interested. And a couple of years later, there was a course at Tufts, a chiropractic for vets. And the neurology part of it was being taught by a very famous guy, Carl Stefano. He's one of the original animal chiropractors. He's a neurologic chiropractor, and he's someone who could like touch you here and then talk you through everywhere where that touch went in the brain and the spinal cord and everything like that. He's absolutely brilliant. Well, Carl was going through divorce, and he had committed to doing this and couldn't do it. And he asked me if I could teach that instead. So I put the stuff together for this. I went to teach it with Judith, and we just decided, we need to teach this posture thing, because I think that's really the fundamental. It comes before any kind of fancy adjusting. Kate Kennedy was at that meeting. I don't know if you know of Kate Kennedy. She's an absolute brilliant massage therapist. She was doing myofascial release. She was demonstrating this for the students. But before you do any of that, you need to give the horse a neutral posture. So the neutral posture is foundational. So we decided we'd try to teach this. And so I put together some lectures. And then we got my friend Liz, who was one of my riding friends, but she was also a dancer and a classically trained dressage rider and an Alexander teacher. And we said, okay, let's get everybody here for a weekend and see how it goes. So we invited pretty much every single important holistic veterinary teacher who was out there. Peggy Fleming was there. Alan Schoen was there. Alan's partner was there. Blanking on some of the names, but it was a group of 15 people, and they were all the top of the top. And what we tried to cram into them in one weekend is what we eventually had as 3 full courses.
Oh my goodness.
That's where it started, and that's where we went from there. We did the postural rehabilitation in person, and it was for veterinarians, chiropractors, and in theory for physios. I think we only got 1 or 2 physios over the years, so it went really well. Except that I'm not very good at marketing and selling things, so we'd send out cards once a year or something like that. Yeah. But this was also before the internet, so
yeah.
I mean, I was an early adopter, so I had hey, we're going to have a website. This will be really cool. This is 2006, right?
Yep. Yeah. Amazing.
So we go on, and we're training people doing with dogs and horses. So we have the dog track and the horse track. And I applied for a grant from American Holistic Veterinary Medical Foundation because they really wanted some horse projects that they wanted to fund. So we designed a study to test this postural model. And the way to test it was we had theories about what was happening. And we wanted to go to a facility where you could put the horse on 4 different force plates, 1 for each foot. And then, when the horse is standing this way or that way, you'd see what was going on in the feet. So that was our theory at any rate. So I talked to Hillary, who I knew through, biomechanics and academic circles, Hillary Clayton, and I invited her to come to one of our courses, and she came, and she said, "Oh, this is pretty cool. Yeah, I'll do that." And so we set up the course. We got the grant. We had everything approved. We had the protocols approved for the animal use and everything like that. 2 weeks before we're going to start, Hillary says, "Yeah, there's a problem. I've decided to retire." And she retired like that and left the university and retired her position and left the McPhail lab. And that was 2 weeks before we were supposed to start. So I was like, holy crap, what are we going to do? So Daisy knew this guy who was a laminitis researcher, and he had a setup that he used that was similar to what the McPhail lab had in some ways for testing horses with laminitis to see how they recover from founder. So he had 4 force plates, but they weren't 3-dimensional force plates. They were only up and down force plates. So they were essentially like 4 scales,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So you put the horse in the scale, and there you go. And we thought, that's probably okay, because our hypothesis was that this abnormal compensatory posture, which is the legs canted in, so like, the legs, instead of being vertical like a table, they're pointing in towards the middle of the horse's
The
body.
midline, yep.
So Judith had this theory. Judith's father was an airline pilot, and he always talked about pitch, yaw, and roll. And so Judith said, what, I think what's going on there, because one of the pathognomic signs of abnormal compensatory posture is having wider frogs behind than in front. So the typical horse who stood like this, and typically they all have long toes and what we call underrun heels, low heels. The low heels are actually very long heels, but they're long forward instead of long down.
Mm-hmm.
So this model always comes with really narrow, terrible frogs in front, often thrushy. There's no, it's very crappy front feet. And then the hind feet are like, oh, beautiful line. This was so common that, like, when I started hanging around horses again in the late 90s, 80s, and went to vet school, I thought that was normal for the hind feet to be bigger than the front feet. Mm-hmm. So Judith's theory was that it was a pitch to the rear, that when the horses stood that way, they actually were putting their weight on the hind end. And her reasoning for this is that all of these horses have hock arthritis and negative plantar ankles and all of these hind leg problems, right? Well, when we put them on the force plates at this other facility in Texas, guess what? It turns out that no matter how they stand, horses are constrained to put 60% of their weight in front and 40% behind. So it wasn't the weight, it was the intra-foot weight. So when you have those hind legs going forward, there's more weight on the heel than on the toe, so you get those big wide frogs. And when you have the front legs going back, there is pressure on the navicular bone from the tightening of the tendons. There's more weight on the toes and less weight on the heels. So the heels become contracted and narrow. Mm-hmm. So eventually that's what we learned from our research. We spent a year going to Texas 5 times, and we taught 7 courses that year, and we presented all our research at AHVMA in Portland. So after that year of 6 trips to Texas and 7 courses, we were so exhausted, and I was so caught up with doing the research analysis that we didn't have time to teach anymore. Mm-hmm. So we stopped teaching, and everyone kept saying for the next 10 years, why don't you teach online? Why don't you teach online? So let me tell you about Postural Rehab. Postural Rehab is this incredible team teaching adventure where I teach the conceptual stuff. Judith teaches the practical stuff. How do you apply it to the horse? And Liz teaches the kinesthetic stuff. How do you feel it in your own body so that you know how to connect to the horse and to have this connection between your nervous system? So the Judith stuff and the Liz stuff has to be in person. My stuff can be anywhere.
Right.
So for 10 years, it's like, yeah, we're not doing online because I'm going to do all of the work and have none of the joy. Mm-hmm. But then I figured out a model for which to do this online. And we did it for the first time last January, and it was absolutely fabulous.
Amazing.
And, I thank the pandemic, because before the pandemic, we couldn't imagine that you could do this much stuff online.
Yeah, it really changed so much, didn't it? Yeah.
It really did. It really did. So, Liz is an Alexander teacher, and she teaches at 2 really top conservatories, a musical conservatory, Bard College, and an acting conservatory in New York City. And she had to teach online, and she thought it couldn't be done. And then she found that it could.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And what's really interesting is we did our professional course last winter, and Liz would do a workshop once a week with the students, and she was always like a little nervous. Did it work? I mean, it's not like having hands-on. It's not like being in person. There's something so different. And then we did a in-person course in the summer to teach the actual techniques. And we had, I think, almost 20 people there. And Liz did workshops every morning, but then she also did private lessons with people. And she said that at least half the students reported that they liked online group classes better than in person.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. I
awesome.
mean, something about like being alone in a room by yourself and experimenting.
Yeah.
And that's what so much of it is the kinesthetic awareness and the somatic experiencing. It's like, where am I feeling this in my body? Am I rolling around on the floor? I mean, I don't want to roll on the floor in front of 20 people.
Exactly. Well, it sounds like it's been such an amazing path. And I want to get into some of the geeky parts of our conversation today, but I'm so glad that you've arrived here with this work. Um, some of the things I read through a little bit of your PhD research on the nuchal ligament, and I also read a amazing piece, and we'll see if I get this right because we chatted about the pronunciation before on the gnathic
Yeah, got it.
ish system. So as we were chatting about it, this concept of dentistry, tooth balance, and what you called the
Occlusal equilibration, the occlusion of the teeth.
Mhm.
And we want to equilibrate them so that there's free movement during the chewing cycle, but also when you're just going around your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know for myself as a body worker, this is a real gap. And I would love to chat with you about what you see as far as first the relationship between posture, dentistry, the TMJ. And this is I think a big piece. And then second, would love to hear kind of your thoughts on how you would like to see equine dentistry shifting. So those are two big questions. First,
That's a big rant.
relationship is here between the TMJ and posture.
So, I mean, this is like a whole lecture's worth, but let
Yeah,
me see if I can get it really focal. So, your brain would really like to not hit the ground,
yeah,
right? This is a top priority of the brain. So how is it going to do that? It's going to have all kinds of things reporting about where it is in space. And so we have the inner ear that's going to report on, the movement of the head, and it's going to report on gravity. And we have the feet on the ground, and we say, where is the body in relation to the feet? But you know what's really close to the brain? The TMJ joint. So the TMJ joint is at the same level of the bottom of the brain case. So it's where all this like really critical stuff like the pituitary gland is. It's where the spinal cord exits the brain. So the TMJ is right where it's important. So the body says, oh, this is a great idea. Let's make sure that the feet stay under the TMJ. So if you take your jaw and shift it off to, let's say, the right, you
mm-hmm.
will find that you will start feeling more weight on your sits bones on that side, or if you're standing up on your feet. And the same thing over to the left. And if you stick your jaw out like a big Simpsons type cartoon,
Mm-hmm.
you'll tip forward, and an underbite, you'll tip back. So your brain is adjusting your body weight based on where the jaw is. So that's one thing. Then the second thing that people don't realize is that horse teeth are really different than our teeth. So our teeth, we have baby teeth, and then we get adult teeth, and they're like there in the mouth, and that's it. But horses, because they, and not just horses, cows, deer, any kind of grazing animal that spends its life eating stuff like that, they're going to wear down their teeth because they're going to have like grit and stuff in there, and grass has silica, which is like glass. So the natural ecology of herbivores is to have a very different kind of tooth. They call it a hypsodontic tooth. And I show all these slides in the PR course where like a horse is born with all of these teeth reaching way up into its jaw. So it's like, why is the horse's mouth so big? Because it's got these teeth there. And the teeth, as they live, they continually grinding away. And as they grind away, a little more erupts. How long do they keep erupting? Kind of till their mid-20s. Mm-hmm. But they don't erupt evenly. So somebody did a study like 50, 60 years ago and said like, oh, well, the average horse lives 25 before their teeth expire. That means they erupt like 2 millimeters a year, because this is how much tooth we can measure, in the young horse. But the teeth erupt a lot in the young horse. So let's say from when their teeth first come into full occlusion at age 5 to, let's say, age 11 or 12, they're erupting a lot, like 5 or 7 millimeters a year.
Wow.
So that's a lot. And then they start slowing down in their teens. And then by the time they get to be in their 20s, the eruption is pretty small. It's like maybe 1 or 2 millimeters a year. So a dentist has to be smart enough to understand that they can make changes in a younger horse that they cannot make in an older horse.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of changes does a dentist want? The dentist wants to have the jaws be able to bring the teeth together. So horses' lower jaws are much narrower than their upper jaws, so they can't chew on both sides at the same time. They have to move their jaw over to one side. Mm-hmm. And then they grind on one side. And if you're like wondering, is your Hearthless teeth okay? One thing you can do is watch them graze for 20 minutes. They should switch sides several times, what side they're chewing on, in the course of 20 minutes. So what happens is that life happens and babies play and kick each other in the face, and then you have other stuff going on, and the teeth get uneven. So you have trapezoidal distortion patterns in the teeth, you have missing teeth, you have broken teeth, you have all kinds of things that prevent the mastication cycle from doing its thing in the right way. So once the teeth, which are continually erupting, lose that symmetry, so the guidance of the chewing cycle is with the incisors in the front of the mouth and the TMJ in the back of the mouth. And it goes in kind of like a circular, or some people say a figure 8 pattern. And this has been studied extensively. When you lose the symmetry of that, you tend to get patterns that exacerbate each other. So back to abnormal compensatory posture, the typical thing that we see in horses who have abnormal compensatory posture, which is that goat on a rock, legs canted in posture, is that they have problems in their dentition that restrict the front-back movement. So if the horse is supposed to chew in a circular pattern, that's front, back, side, side. Mm-hmm. If they can't do front to back, then they do just side to side. Well, if they do just side to side, all of those asymmetries and weirdnesses and steps and hooks and stuff like that get dug deeper and deeper and deeper. And if nobody who knows what they're doing sees the horse over the course of, let's say, their young adult life, by the time they get to be 8 or 9 years old, that mouth is going to be a big mess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that TMJ is going to be impacted. And the posture.
Yeah, so the TMJ can heal really well. The TMJ, unlike the limb joints, it doesn't have hyaline cartilage. It has fibrocartilage, because the TMJ has this disc. And this is really cool. I love teaching this. So, if you have this jaw, does all this stuff. So it goes up and down, side to side, front to back. So how do you get the joint to do all those different movements? Well, one way to do it is like the hip joint. It's a ball and socket, but we don't have a ball and socket in the TMJ. The TMJ is a lot more like the lumbosacral joint, which is that you've got a rounded bar that comes around like this. So how do we do this? We get a meniscus, like in the knee. It's a piece of the joint that sits between the different parts of the joint and fills in the gaps between all of those different movements. So that meniscus can change shapes. We call it the TMJ disc, and it will change shapes depending on what's needed to balance that particular mouth. So the TMJ will adapt to what that mouth is doing. So when you have, let's say, dental work done, skilled dental work on a horse who has a lot of dental issues, hopefully the practitioner knows what they're doing and walks the line between giving them better function but not making it that they can't eat. But sometimes you change. So for instance, I knew a guy, an equine vet, who felt that he should never touch the incisors because above all, do no harm. And he imagined that you could do harm on the incisors. Well, To be fair, there was a period of time where it was very fashionable to do what was called an incisor reduction. So if you look at a baby horse, their teeth are going to be like kind of vertical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as they get older and older, you see them getting what they call long in the tooth, right? So you could imagine you see a horse with, basically occlusion that looks like that in the front of their mouth because the teeth have actually been pushed out at a big slant. So that's not supposed to happen. Why does it happen with domestic horses? Because they're eating hay instead of grazing. So a horse, 50 million years of evolution, they're eating grass, they're browsing, they're eating stuff like that, they're biting things off, they're wearing down their incisors at the same rate as they're wearing down their molars. So when you have the horses living in an environment where they're eating grain for energy, they're having pre-cut forage, they're being fed a couple of meals a day instead of eating all day long, you start to have a disengagement of the natural balance mechanisms in the mouth. Mm-hmm. So there came a time, maybe in the 90s, where people started saying, like, oh, let's fix those long incisors, and they would just whack them off. Well, if you whack them off without being taken care where the pulp cavities are, you've got a dead tooth. So there was a feeling among veterinarians that non-veterinary dentists were being too aggressive on changing the incisors, and they wanted to back off from that so far. So what would happen if you worked on a mouth and you changed the level of the molars, but didn't change the level of the incisors? What do you think would happen?
Oh, I've seen it over and over and over again.
Yeah, the teeth no longer can meet.
No, exactly. The teeth don't touch.
The teeth can't touch anymore. They don't have a grinding surface. And the response that you see in the horses, why they're unwilling to eat, this is a very technical thing. You said you wanted to nerd out, so I will let you nerd out to this degree. There's something called the vertical dimension of occlusion. So if you imagine your own chewing habits, there you are, you're chewing your cereal, you're chewing your thing. So there's a certain length of muscle in between, your cheekbone and your jaw that is the most common range that you use in your chewing cycle. So when these horses have a loss of molar surface, but they still have the long incisors, there is a dislocation of the vertical dimension of occlusion, and the muscles just all go, ah, and they don't know what to do. And it can take 3 or 4 weeks for the horses to recover their ability to chew.
Wow.
So my soapbox on equine dentistry is this, is that the racetrack, I worked at the racetrack for a number of years. You don't need anything other than floating at the racetrack because there's not many horses older than 5 years old. Now, I worked at a really crappy racetrack, which had a lot of older racehorses, and they had some horses who had aged out of racing and were ponies on the track. So, I mean, it's not that you shouldn't have better dentistry, but the sharp points are something that is a maintenance thing because the horses aren't getting enough rough fiber and they're not eating enough. And then there's like the stuff that veterinarians have to do, like, the complicated extractions, and they're doing root canals these days, all kinds of stuff. That is definitely in the realm of the veterinarian. In between, we have occlusal equilibration. I think there should be a separate license and training and certification for occlusal equilibration. And it needs to be standardized, and we need to know what those people can do. And we need to train enough people so that every horse in the world can get this adequate dentistry, which is critically important for their welfare and well-being.
Yes, I'm applauding you on your soapbox.
Yeah, but there's a lot of different factors, and the non-veterinary dentists have their own groups that are try to do this and that and the other thing, and then the veterinary dentists, they're very there's a college of equine veterinary dentistry, and my one of my PR students who took the course in January, she is a veterinarian who specializes in dental work, and she's in the northern Midwest, Minnesota and North Dakota, and she does a lot of stuff, but she refers the complicated extractions. to the board certified, people at the university. And she said, it's like I'd like them to call themselves dental surgeons. I mean, that's what they are. They're
Yeah.
dental surgeons.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
she definitely wanted to up her education on the occlusive equilibration
Yes.
because, it's one of these things. It's like, how do you become a master cabinet maker? You can't go to school to be a master cabinet maker. You can learn some basic stuff, but if you want to be able to do the really fine work, you need to apprentice with a master. So I tell people, it's really embarrassing. I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of dental practitioners in the US who I would send people to. And if I add in Europe, I'd add two or three more.
Yep.
And
It's
that's
not a
not a
lot.
lot.
Not a
That's not a
lot.
lot. And that isn't to say that there aren't more. It's just that I don't happen to know them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that viewpoint, and I wanted to track back to because you'd mentioned something also geeky and really neat about the I believe you called it trigeminal afferents.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get into that because I think this is also important to understand why dentistry is so critical, like good dentistry is so critical for our horses, and being educated about what that as a horse owner, as a steward, about what that might look like so that you know one way or the other if your horse is receiving, you know,
Yeah.
dental care that is working well for them. So can you share a little bit about what that is, that trigeminal afferents?
So, when we try to tell people that dentistry is important for performance, they're just like, what? It's like, what? This is so crazy. Why would you even say something so stupid? And so, what I was saying earlier is that when I first started studying this, what I found is that there was a lot of very serious research having to do with the relationship of the proprioceptors in the TMJ joint and the dental-alveolar joints, the joints of the teeth into the mouth socket, where those nerves are tracking directly into the vestibular nuclei of the brain at three different levels. They're going to the cerebellum, to the midbrain, and to the brainstem. So that proves, when you look at that research and see how you can actually anatomically track them to these areas, that tells us that this is a very important function of this thing. So it's not just the chewing. It's also like if you're just listening to me there and I'm yakking away and you're just waiting for your turn to talk, you're not clenching your teeth, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Your
Yep.
jaw is hanging a little bit loose. And where is it hanging? It's hanging in response to gravity. Gravity is the force that unites us all. So if your TMJ is relaxed and your jaw is slightly loose, it's hanging down. So it's reporting to the brain where down is. The TMJ is located in the skull itself. And the brain would really like to keep, there's a wonderful quote from Tristan Roberts, who literally wrote the book on posture. He wrote a book called The Neurophysiology of Postural Mechanisms. And Tristan Roberts has this quote, I can't get it exactly right, but the highest priority of the brain is to keep from coming to unceremonious contact with the planet. So basically, you don't want to face plant.
That's
So if
perfect.
that's the top priority of the nervous system, what do we need to engage to keep it there? So, again, you can stand up and experiment in your own body. You have a fully developed nervous system. You have mastered the art of standing up and not falling over. And you will find that if you put your jaw over too far to the right, you do enough of that, you're going to step over to make sure that you don't fall.
Mm, mm.
This is hardwired into our nervous systems. Don't fall over. So if we have these horses whose teeth continue to erupt, living an unnatural life, having an unnatural diet, having asymmetries that are brought in either congenitally, as in ECVM horses, or juvenile injuries, as in foals playing together and bashing into fences, and stuff that happens with humans. They rise up on cross ties and
Yep.
bash
Yep.
their facial bones together. All this stuff happens that puts distortion into the skull and the teeth and the TMJ. And if the teeth are crooked, the rest of the body follows.
Oh yeah. Yeah. With my osteopathy training, it's like that is just huge, right? We think of the connection to the dura, which goes all the way down to the sacral, sacral gray
Exactly.
2, and
Exactly.
all these connections down and through. And it's so true. I mean, I can't think of many horses that maybe haven't hit their head hit their pole in the barn, which is, occipital bone and all these
Yeah.
things that
Yeah.
just happen with domestication in our horses.
Happens with domestication. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Wow.
mean, it probably happens in the wild as well, but maybe those are the horses that don't survive.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, in my sense, when I see clients on the table, and our posture is obviously different as humans. We're standing up in a different relationship with gravity, and
But it's also the same.
when they're in those compensations, they're working so much harder to stay there, right? Like that's what I see in my clients is
Mhm.
is their body working so hard to be in gravity.
It is such hard work to not be neutral.
Yeah.
But here, I mean, this is the key to what we teach and why we feel this is so important. Like, I mean, this is for Judith and Liz and I, this is our mission for the world, that you have to understand the relationship of structure and function. If you have distorted structures, and let's say among humans, what's the distorted structure? I mean, aside from injury and stupid stuff, it's sitting at a desk all day. It's wearing high heeled shoes. It's
Looking at your
playing
phone.
football. It's looking at your phone. All of those things. When you have structural distortion, the function is compensating for that. So we look at the three big inputs to postural control. Now, yes, of course, the vestibular system is going to go into posture, but things don't go wrong with the vestibular system very often. It's in a very protected area. That inner ear, all of those little bits and bobs, they're really well protected. It doesn't happen very often. I mean, sometimes, but rarely. But we're looking at the teeth, the feet, and the upper cervicals.
Mm-hmm.
Probably also the lower cervicals. Now we're realizing a lot more about
Yep.
the lower cervicals. But the pole is this really critical area because it's controlling head position. There's 500 times the density of muscle spindle cells in these small muscles that control the head and neck than there are in the rest of the muscles in the body.
Mm.
So when you have distorted structures, you cannot have neutral function. You're always going to be compensated. So we can do the most beautiful body work, most fabulous chiropractic adjustment, the most amazing training, all of that. It's going to be temporary because the distortions in the feet and the distortions of the teeth are going to keep on saying like, hey, 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 no, that's not where down is. It's over here. It's in my weird foot. It's, they're getting bad information, garbage in, garbage out. So we have to have a comprehensive program where we correct the structures and we reset function. And that's what we teach practitioners to do in PR Professional.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I love that. I would love to get more into the specifics on the neck. You talked a little bit about ECVM. This is coming more and more to the forefront, and from what I've seen, thankfully, is I think it's affecting many horses. And I also find, when I was working a lot with horses, the pole would just be a consistent area of all sorts of things going on. But I always thought of it like, okay, here we are, the foot on the fire hose, right? Like yeah.
Yeah,
Right?
all the nerves from the rest of the body have to get to the brain.
Totally.
What happens when things are not going well there? What happens if there's restrictions in the pole, restrictions in the movement, and then, as you were saying before, the dural torque. The dural torque from pole misalignment and compensatory spasming and muscles on one side, all of that is going to affect the rest of the body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are you noticing as far as now that you've learned about ECVM and that sort of side of things? Are you seeing that more often? Are you noticing that within your postural work?
Well, it's interesting. I have not been working on horses last 5 or 6 years. Like before the pandemic, I had a shoulder injury that got really bad. I mean, I've been working on it for 20 years and it got really bad, kind of like 2016, 2017. And then there was the pandemic. And then it's like, yeah, I'm old. I'm not going back to this.
Working on horses is hard.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, like Judith is tough as nails. I mean, she is, 70 years old and she is still, yeah, she's amazing. Anyway, so, the ECVM stuff kind of just emerged lately. And it, so like when I learned about this, I first learned about it from Dr. Katharina Ross, who I've known for many years as an dentist. And we met at a dental meeting like in 2009 or something like that. And when I was in Europe speaking at a European dental conference in maybe it was 2011, she asked me to look at her horse. And she this was in, I think she was in Hamburg then, or I can't remember what city. Anyway, so she dragged me away from the conference and said, "Come here, you got to see my horse." And so she took me to her home, which is this amazing place. And her horse was really, really locked in the lower cervicals. And so I worked with him and I messed around with him. I said, I don't know what's wrong with him, but he is really, really locked in there. And, and I showed her how to do an exercise that we do called pretty neck, which is, well, the pretty neck is kind of the second part of the exercise. But the first part is basically freeing up the cervical thoracic junction and getting it to extend, kind of like doing this telescoping gesture. And so I taught her to do that on her horse. And 10 years later, it's like, oh yeah, this horse has ECVM unilateral. And that was wrong with the horse. And the horse continued he was a jumper, flew over the jumps. This was people saw this horse oh my God, he's so incredible. He would jump 50% higher than the jump. In hindsight, he jumped so high because he had no idea where his legs were.
He couldn't feel himself.
By the time she diagnosed him, by the time they figured out how to diagnose this without the horse being dead and taken apart, she has a photograph she sent me where she has marks of paint on the horse, and this whole, from his neck all the way down, all the way to his front leg to the carpus, he feels nothing in the skin. She can pinch it. She can pinch it with a forceps. He feels nothing. And then there's other sections that are hyperreactive. So, her horse, now we know he is missing the C6 pedicle and has the transposition to C7, and he's also missing his first rib. Wow. So he has the worst, kind of thing. And we were saying it's she told me that she used to think that it was better if they were bilateral rather than unilateral, because at least then they'd be symmetrical. And she says, now I don't think that anymore. I think that if they have one good side, then at least they can stand up. Oh. So, when we not to get this all about ECVM, but when I was in practice, starting in the 90s, late 90s, and, all through the 2010, 15, when I would go see a horse who was a particularly fancy horse, imported from Germany or Holland or a place like that, the one thing that I found is that they were like a rock in their lower neck, like a rock. Yeah. I would work on them for hours to loosen up the lower neck. And I look back at it now, it's like, oh, oops, I took away their lifeline. That was all they had holding them together.
That was their compensation.
That was what they did. They had to hold themselves together with muscles because they couldn't otherwise. And, the people who are involved with this movement, it's very clear that you blame the fashion of having horses who are hypermetric. It's the more you select for hypometria, the more you're going to include these horses who have malformations, because when they're young, they sure do float.
They sure do float. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that hypermobility and that fancy.
And it comes along with several other congenital malformations and problems, the PSSM and all. There are a lot of things that are being selected for when we select horses for fancy movement. And I don't think we did that 30 years ago.
No. And I do wonder myself about, coming back to your study on the nuchal ligament that long ago, and wondering if we select for horses that have decreasing amounts of stability in their nuchal ligament,
Well, that's a very interesting point too. So, Sharon May Davis has done the most research in this area.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And she was the one who very long time ago noticed that domestic horses she wrote a paper. It was like one of the very earliest things she published. And it wasn't an academic paper. It was for like maybe it was like
Yes,
and it was
a
called The
journal.
Disappearing Lamellar Nuchal Ligament. So she had noticed that when she dissected these horses, that almost none of the horses had a C6 lamellar portion. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, I remember the same thing when I took apart horses for my dissertation. It's like, oh yeah, it's just really sketchy. You don't really need much of it. And it's like you look at a zebra, you look
Oh
at
yeah.
a
Ooh.
donkey, solid. They have a nuchal ligament going to every single cervical vertebrae, and it is massive. So this is something we did to horses.
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
wanted them to have delicate necks.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's yeah, even I saw a friend's picture with a Mongolian horse riding a Mongolian horse, and I was like, damn, look at that neck. Like you can
Yeah,
see,
yeah,
right? The strength.
it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And these
Yeah,
little horses being able to support big riders, happily, right? Yeah. It's very interesting to see that difference in their bodies. So yeah, that's so interesting to me how that sort of come around and how you remembered back to your study and were, like, huh, okay. Mm, wow.
yeah.
Wow.
It's not new. It's been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
And the malformations of the ECVM, those have been around for a long time. And like we've seen them. We know there have been several studies. Sharon I found some historical specimens, and so did Dr. Ross and her group found some historical so there have been very important sires in
Ah,
these lines that have had this malformation, and for them, it gave them a certain performance edge. So if you're talking about thoroughbred racehorses, the hypermobility allows them to have a longer stride.
yes. Yeah.
So if you get, like another, 10 centimeters with each stride and you're a good athlete, you're going to go faster. And we don't know about these horses and their soundness because horses like that stop racing when they're 3 years old.
Yep.
Before their bodies reach maturity, before those growth plates closed, they are already gone out to stud.
Yep. Yep. And starting to breed that into the next lineages.
Breeding that into the next generation. So the work that Dr. Ross and her colleagues in Holland are doing, they've created a inbreeding coefficient for known effective horses and saying like, well, if you look at this breeding, what is the inbreeding coefficient and what do we see empirically is a safe amount of this line of this famous sire that you can incur. Because if you look at the pedigrees for horses back 4 or 5 generations, yep, because of the artificial insemination inbreeding, you can have like 10, 15 copies of the same sire.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. So it's so inbred. Yeah. Yeah.
It's inbred and it's only the humans they know that. Because if you look, even in a natural breeding situation, you just can't get that amplification.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Oh boy. It's a lot to be with, I would say. Hey, it's just, yeah, it's pretty intense. I wanted to finish off just for all those horse people out there that are wondering about their own horses and say they have a horse that I have one myself like this that has challenges with posture and tends to be on and again, off again, lame and has arthritis already, was diagnosed at 4, speaking of
Oh my
inbreeding.
God.
And what you might say in terms of how we can help these horses. Is there
Yeah.
anything, I'm not going to say small, but is there anything that we can do to support our horses? Because I think this
Yeah.
is something a lot of
Neutral
people are
posture
dealing with. Yeah.
foundation.
Yeah.
Having neutral posture is foundational. So the first thing you do is you notice it. You notice, how does the horse stand? If I'm looking across the field at the horse, are they standing with their legs perpendicular to the center of the earth, or are they standing in a way that looks a little hard to support? So when you think about it, like when we look at that goat on a rock posture,
Mm-hmm.
with the legs canted in, the position the legs are in, those are positions for locomotion. That's the position the leg is when the front leg is coming back off the ground and the hind leg is coming forward. So that means that the horse has to take their locomotion muscles to support that posture.
Mm.
Locomotion muscles are designed to go on, off, on, off. They're not
Not
designed to stay.
stabilize.
all day.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It's a different structure, it's a different fiber, it's a different organization. All of those things are different for postural muscles than for mobilizer muscles. So if you notice that your horse has a consistent abnormal compensatory posture, then you're saying, okay, well, what is the reason? So we know that the big three reasons are going to be the feet, the teeth, and the function of the neck. So you start where you can.
Mm-hmm.
So my friend Rachel Hart
Oh,
Bellini,
I had
she's
her on. She's lovely.
yes, Rachel's great, and she's got this mission, and she's doing all this amazing distance work with the Surefoot pads. So
Oh,
she has
yes.
like clients, in far off Canada, and she got the Surefoot pads, and she's working with them on Zoom, and okay, put them on this pad, and this and that, and then there's the education of the farriers and having the farriers work with someone knowledgeable in order to get them really understanding the balance of the foot. And there's a lot of farriers who mean really well, but get really tied into old ways of thinking. And it was wonderful. There was just a big conference in Saratoga. This is like a yearly event, and they have like both vets and podiatry
Yep.
experts there, sometimes overlapping. And my friend Ashley, who has been a PR person for a long time, she's a farrier in that area, and she sent a photograph of a slide that basically says the correct trim cycle for a horse is 4 weeks.
Yes. Thank goodness. Amen.
4 weeks. That's 28
Amen.
days.
Yep.
That's right. None of this like, oh, a
6, 8
6, but we could
weeks.
push them to 8.
Oh,
When
yep.
we did the research in Texas, all the horses, this was East Texas, so it was kind of sandy and moist, deep sand, and that's how they got away with it. But they trimmed the horses 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah.
And same with the dogs. The dogs, people say oh, he was just trimmed at the vet in January, with the toenails. How often do you file your nails? About every 2 weeks. Guess
Yep.
what? Your dog's nails need to get cut every 2 weeks. Very few dogs get enough exercise to wear their own toenails.
Totally. Totally. That is a good point. I'm going to trim my dog's nails tonight.
So we're teaching the postural rehab, and we're teaching it for riders.
Yep.
And for the riders, we're not going to make them go through all the really deep nerdy stuff. But basically, here's what you need to know about the teeth. Here's what you need to know about the feet.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you need to
Mm-hmm.
know about the neck. And here's what you need to know about the environment and the management that's going to
Yes.
affect all of these things. And so we have this 4-week course, and every week there's a couple of lectures, and there's a question and answer session with Judith, and we have a fabulous workshop with Liz. And this will get people on the track to understanding what they need to do and what kind of resources they can have to getting their horses back on track.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
At equineposture.com.
Equineposture.com. I was just going to ask you right now what the website was. So that's great. And how people can get in touch with you. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you, Karen.
It's been great, Alexa. It's a lot of fun.
Amazing. So how do people get in touch with you? Where do you want to send them? And yeah.
Well, we have a Facebook page where
Yep.
I post a lot of cool stuff, and that's Postural Rehabilitation for Horses and Dogs. And as I said, we have a first time, we're really doing it for the first time for like riders and horse owners, people who are just not wanting all the medical jargon
Yep.
and stuff. And so that's going to be starting in October. It's going to be
Amazing.
starting at the end of October, and that'll go for 4 weeks. And then in January, we're going to run the professional course. So we had such an amazing group in the professional course last year. We had farriers and massage therapists, energy workers, saddlers, and someone who ran a rescue barn, and of course, vets and chiropractors and physiotherapists and people from all over the world. I mean, Europe and Taiwan and Australia.
Oh,
I mean, it was
amazing.
just so wonderful.
That's
An amazing
awesome.
group of people who were just really, really committed to making the lives better for horses.
Oh, and that's what it's all about. Absolutely. Oh, well, it's such a pleasure having you on. I'm very inspired by you and your story and your work. Yes. Mm.
Thank you. It's great
Hmm.
talking to you.
You as well. Thanks everybody for listening in, and I hope you learned something. I know I did tonight. That was wonderful, geeky, and so interesting. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for listening in today. I wanted to share about a brand new project that I hope you might be interested in. This is a new company, a new vision, and it's called Outside the Box Equine. And the very first offering of this new project is a brand new online course. And it is on something that many of you know is very near and dear to me, which is horsekeeping. And it is all about how to build a horse track system and specifically how to do so in a wet climate like here on the West Coast. My vision, my goal is to change how we keep horses on the West Coast, here in Canada and in the US, and start to shift into a space where horses are kept in ways that is species specific and really working for them, working for all. So head over to the new website, check it out. There's a few blog posts there already. It's outsidetheboxequine.com, and you can sign up to receive notice when the online course is ready for you to sign up. Okay, would love to hear your thoughts and hope that you sign up for the newsletter so you can get all the deets when it's ready.